And to Ann Kennedy for inviting me to Tales of Cape Cod. I'll begin by doing a synopsis of the book and then follow it with a few images. Then I'll address the most frequently asked questions, then do 2 short readings, and then open up for questions. Bathsheba Spooner was the next to last of 7 children born to Timothy Ruggles and Bathsheba born Newcomb. Mrs. Ruggles had birthed 8 children from her first marriage, the mother's roots firmly planted in one of Cape Cod's oldest families. Her father's from Roxbury. Timothy was born in 1711, descendant of a family long involved in Massachusetts politics, but none enjoyed the status to which he would rise. A brigadier general in the French and Indian War, he had also served as Speaker of the Massachusetts House for 2 years. His reputation suffered dramatically when, as delegate to the Stamp Act Congress of 65 in New York, he refused to join those protesting the actions of Parliament and King George III. Now firmly planted in the camp of those loyal to the king, he freely accepted the position of mandamus counselor, one of the men who were appointed by the king's governor. Sure. How's that? A little better? Right there? Maybe? How's that? Okay. Okay, it's this side. Okay. That year, her father was appointed to the position of mandamus counselor, one of the men who were appointed by the king's governor to the Upper Massachusetts House to do the king's bidding. Few men were as detested in Massachusetts in the year 1774. That year, he was banished from his new hometown of Hardwick, a town his ancestors had founded and he himself nurtured. He remained in British-controlled Boston until evacuation day, March 17, 1776, when he was removed with most Tories to Staten Island. In the meantime, daughter Bathsheba had married Joshua Spooner of Boston, a businessman slash land speculator slash lumber salesman. The couple settled in Brookfield, not far from nearby Hardwick. The marriage may have been an arranged one, a marriage which gossipers usually characterized as inharmonious. 16-year-old militiaman Ezra Ross of Topsfield, a native of Ipswich, left his hospital camp in 1777 in Peekskill, New York, to venture home. En route, he was taken in by Bathsheba in Brookfield and nursed back to health. He returned to Topsfield, then headed west again that fall to join what would become the Battle of Saratoga. The British had hoped to cut New England off from the remaining 9 colonies, General Burgoyne's troops heading south to meet up with General Howe's troops heading north. It was not to be. Howe instead focused on Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne to fend off the increasing masses of American troops north of Albany. His entire army surrendered to American General Gates. Marched to Boston, the British POWs were quartered in Cambridge and Charlestown. Both Sergeant James Buchanan and Private William Brooks managed to escape, not a difficult task, and likely met each other in Worcester for the first time. Now February 1778, the men were apparently headed to Springfield for work, when during a fierce snowstorm, they were called into the Spooner home. They remained there for the next few weeks, Bathsheba plotting her husband's murder with them. In the meantime, young Ezra Ross, just having attempted to poison Mr. Spooner, left with him to prepare his Princeton property, soon to be handed over to Spooner's brother. Ross never made it to Princeton, apparently borrowing Spooner's horse to return to Topsfield. All rendezvoused in Brookfield the evening of March 1st, 1778. It is unclear if their meeting was coincidental or arranged. Having dined with a friend and his wife, Joshua returned home alone through the snow and was assaulted at his well, beaten to death, and thrown in while his wife finished eating her dinner. The clothes he wore and those from his chamber, along with his cash, were distributed among the 3 men who fled on horseback and foot. All were arrested the next day. The trial took place in Worcester in late April. Abraham Lincoln's distant cousin as defense attorney, Robert Treat Paine, a signer of the Declaration, as prosecutor, in a trial organized by Governor John Hancock. With the trial lasting just over a day plus, all were found guilty. The date of execution was originally set for early June, but the four received a stay until July 2nd. Bathsheba claimed pregnancy. The officials in Boston allowed an exam to be done, proving that she was not with child. She insisted a second exam, not authorized, instead confirmed her pregnancy, but the Boston authorities would not relent. Despite an informal third exam proving her right, her execution date was not changed. On June 10th, Abigail Adams wrote to her son John Quincy with his father in Paris. The modern history of our own times furnishes as black a list of crimes as can be paralleled in ancient time, even if going back to Nero, Caligula, or Cesare Borgia. All four accomplices were hanged July 2nd. An autopsy requested by Bathsheba confirmed her pregnancy of 5 months with a male child. Timothy Ruggles eventually found his way to Nova Scotia, where, as a loyal servant to the crown, he was granted a multi-hundred-acre estate, which he fostered as he had his legendary estate in Hardwick. His wife chose to stay behind in Massachusetts with their son, Timothy Jr. Timothy died in 1795 and was buried near his home in Nova Scotia. To this day, the burial site in Green Hill Park in Worcester of Bathsheba and her unborn son has never been located. It remains Worcester County's favorite mystery. Show a few slides. This is Timothy Ruggles. This is courtesy of the Library of Congress. This is the only image we have of him, and this, in fact, is a reproduction of the original. This is an 18th century map of Staten Island, where Timothy Ruggles was exiled to, along with most other Tories from the northern colonies. Courtesy of the Worcester Art Museum, this is Timothy Ruggles. This is his estate in Hardwick. It was done by his brother-in-law in Worcester, Winthrop Chandler. On the right-hand side, you see his actual home. The building to the left was added for artistic purposes to balance the composition. If you look right in the main door over here, you see a cleric in red, which might be a little strange. Timothy Ruggles, also strangely, was a Congregationalist, as you might know. Most loyalists were Anglican, but he certainly, being a loyalist, he had many Anglican friends. So maybe it's not so strange that he has an Anglican bishop in the doorway. If you look at the top right, you can't see where you are. There's a 12-year-old girl leaning out the window. Could very likely be a Bathsheba. It's not possible. Nothing remains of the estate except for a few field stones in Hardwick. Brookfield Center, the murder took place about a third of a mile to the left of the church here. I couldn't access the slides, but in about 1976, the Brookfield Historical Commission put up for the bicentennial a marker at the murder site. Levi Lincoln, the president's fifth cousin, following he's the attorney for Bathsheba and her cohorts. Following the trial, Thomas Jefferson named him Attorney General, and following that, he became governor of Massachusetts. His son was also governor. People in Worcester assume Lincoln Square was named after his cousin. It's actually named after his son. Courtesy of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Robert Treat Paine, who was the prosecutor, former signer of the Declaration of Independence. Does the name Treat Paine, or the Treat Williams, mean anything to anybody? Yeah, the Hollywood actor who 6 weeks ago was killed in a motorcycle accident in Vermont. But this is his great cousin, 7 times removed. Thus the name Treat, same name. Courtesy of the Museum of Fine Arts, acting Governor John Hancock, who organized the trial. John Hancock had a home at what is now Lincoln Square in Worcester. It was actually his uncle's home. His uncle bequeathed it to him. He owned a large swath of property in Worcester, running from Lincoln Square today all the way to almost the Holden line. A few years later, Stephen Salisbury bought all of that property. 3 nights following the battles, 3 or 4 nights following the battles of Concord and Lexington, he was in Worcester with Sam Adams, and we think he was also with Paul Revere. We know for a fact with Adams. He and Adams, of course, were on the British hit list. One of the main reasons the British went to Lexington and Concord was not just to seize cannon, it was also to seize the spies, like them, revolutionaries. So he was hiding out in Worcester en route to the Provincial Congress in Philadelphia. This is probably Worcester's most historic building, the second Worcester County Courthouse, 1751. If you know Worcester at all, where Lincoln Square is, the new old courthouse, right at Lincoln Square to the left when you come down Belmont Street. Since 1731, that was the location of all Worcester County courthouses. 20 years ago, they moved the courthouse 3 blocks down the street to a new building. The building that's there from the 1890s is now apartments, converted to apartments. But this building stood on that same site. In 1800, it was removed piece by piece to the west end of Green Street, not far from Polar Park. The family, again, as that area developed in 1895, they dismantled the home again and moved it 2.5 miles northwest, where it currently stands now as a private home. In the Bancroft Heights area, which is an elite area of the city, this was the first building in that area, and the only building that was actually moved to the neighborhood. In 1774, 4,600 men of Worcester County, half the population of the county, surrounded the courthouse and forced the British judges out, along with earlier actions in Springfield and Great Barrington, but more significantly in Worcester, because Worcester was closer to Boston and it was a much larger turnout. This is really where the American Revolution began. The Revolutionary War began in Lexington. The American Revolution began here, where they forced British authorities out of their place of business. In 1778, the Bathsheba Spooner trial, which is not famous just for its notoriety. It was the first capital case in America. Bathsheba Spooner is the first woman executed in the United States. It was the first mass hanging in the United States. The court records are the most extensive court records we have from the American 18th century. And lastly, Prudence, who was an enslaved tavern maid, gave what is likely the first testimony at a capital case by an African American in the country. 4 years later, Bathsheba's attorney, 3 years, Levi Lincoln took on a case in Barre, Massachusetts. Quack Walker escaped to a neighboring farm. He was enslaved by Nathaniel Jennison. Following his escape, to work as a free man. Following his escape, his previous master caught up with him, beat him, brought him back to his farm, kidnapped him for 2 hours in the sawmill. Somehow he escaped. He went back to the Caldwells, his new owners, new employers rather, and they contacted Bathsheba's attorney, Levi Lincoln, who decided to make it a test case in Massachusetts, ending slavery in Massachusetts, the first state in the country to do so. And finally, in 1786, a date which may ring a bell for some of you, Shays' Rebellion took place in Concord, Northampton, Taunton, Great Barrington, Worcester, and most significantly, does anyone know what town was the most important? Springfield. There was an actual battle in Springfield. Okay? The farmers, again, thousands of them surrounded the courthouse again, this time protesting the American government, not the British. The judges remained in place. They did not force them out. They returned to the building a couple times following that. This action, of course, really prompted the expedition of the American Constitution, that there was no real central government, and following these attacks on all of these courthouses by farmers who were very angry over excessive taxation, they decided something had to happen very quickly. So Shays' Rebellion really provoked that. It's now a private home. This is Union Station in Worcester, 1911. So it's just on the edge of downtown. This is the likely site of the execution. Bathsheba's buried to the left, about a half mile. The 2 British men, being foreigners, being enemies, having no financial resources and no one to speak for them there, really. There was 1 British sergeant who was counseling them. Otherwise, no one was there representing them. They were likely buried beneath the gallows, which used to be here. The mystery is Ezra Ross. So he's the teenager from Topsfield, and he's the likely father of the child. It was a 95-degree day, and this sounds like a Hollywood scene, but it actually happened. As the four criminals are mounting the scaffold, a storm to end all storms breaks out. The nooses are flying back and forth. Horses are rearing. Women are fainting at the scaffold, screaming. And then the sun breaks, and they're all executed. And it's again 95 degrees. How did they get Ezra Ross's body from Worcester to Topsfield? By cart. Now, you and I would have taken us 12 hours by carriage. How did they get a body there in that temperature? You know, if ice were at all available in the 18th century, I'm not sure it was, that would have lasted 10 minutes. They could have packed it in straw or hay. I'm not sure how effective that would have been. As you know, body preservation dates only from the Civil War with use formaldehyde or alcohol. So his body made it to Topsfield, and there's a marker there. He's buried alongside his counselor who helped him in Worcester. This slide's a little out of order. This is East Princeton, Mass. This is a mechanics hall they're trying to restore in Princeton from the 1840s. East Princeton is where Joshua Spooner actually bought 500 acres from his father-in-law, Bathsheba's father. Bathsheba's father never had any luck in setting up a potash farm there. As a result, he sold his son-in-law 500 of the 1,500 acres. This was the site, this town, where on Route 2, the potash farm 1 week. Joshua Spooner was supposed to have been murdered by Ezra Ross, poisoned. Ezra Ross had tried to poison him the night before also. Abigail Adams, from a few years earlier than this, in courtesy of the Mass Historical Society. When I was writing the book, and I wrote, again, few women were as astute in Massachusetts, few people were as astute in Massachusetts as Abigail Adams was. She knew the details of everything political. So there's no question in my mind that she was following this trial. As they say, it was in every newspaper. When I was writing the book and I ran across this letter of hers, I said, oh, she has to be referring to Bathsheba. After I wrote the book, I discovered that John Adams was Bathsheba's second cousin. So there's no question in my mind she's referring to the case in that reference I made. This is the marker memorial to Bathsheba's father in Wilmot, W-I-L-M-O-T, Nova Scotia. It's just outside his estate. Green Hill Park in Worcester, this is, I'm not showing. Vietnam Memorial, State Memorial, which was dedicated by John Kerry 20 years ago. I'm showing this because this is on the former estate of Bathsheba's sister, Mary Green. The Greens probably owned, I'm guessing, 20, 30 acres back in the 1770s. They came to Worcester in 1754. The family was originally from Malden, helped to settle Leicester, and from Leicester went on to Worcester. So the property went from probably 30 acres to the 1880s, 600 acres. In 1905, it was given to the city for a nominal sum. Now it's around 400 acres. Your guess is as good as mine where she's buried. It's been suggested, a friend of ours, his granduncle was the groundskeeper at Green Hill Park. He suggests that she's buried just to the right of this and back. Others have said she's buried behind the silo that used to stand behind the family's estate. They had a 60-room estate, which came down in 1957. Others have said, no, she was buried in front of the estate. Some have said she's buried in the golf course beyond here. Who knows? The question is, if your favorite sister had been executed in such a way, would you want her buried within windows distance, viewing distance from your home, or do you want her as far as possible from your home? I guess that's a question of taste. So we'll never know. And my wife have walked this park literally 9,000 times. We've been there since the early 90s. We walk 6 days a week. And every now and then we'll, maybe that stone, but I don't think it would be clearly marked. I think they would disguise it. Deborah Navis, who wrote a book before me on the subject, I think someone took Deborah for a ride. One of her last photographs shows marked as Bathsheba Spooner's gravesite. There are neat granite pillars with metal iron chains around it. There was no way the family would have highlighted her gravesite. It would have been chipped to pieces within 5 years by curiosity seekers. And the question today, of course, what remains? In the 1840s, they unearthed Isaiah Thomas. He was the famous printer from Worcester. They unearthed his bones. He had died about 20 years earlier. They found only dust. So what are they going to find today from a wooden casket that was buried? And he was buried in the tomb that was buried in the earth. The wooden casket would have lasted, 10, 15 years. The bones, another 20 maybe. Yeah. Okay. Let me address a few of the most frequently asked questions. What inspired you to write this book? When my family bought our first home across the street from Green Hill Park, a friend came by to dinner for a few weeks later. He reminded me of the infamous tale of Bathsheba Spooner. A lifelong student of Worcester's history, especially as a village during the Revolution, I wanted to learn more. This being the late 90s, besides a mid-19th century essay and the odd article or two, no full-scale study had ever been done. I decided that my first book would tackle the notorious topic. While in the middle of research, and with a book about one-third written, Deborah Navis's book appeared in 1999. Well-written and scholarly, I admired her contribution, yet I still hungered for a less academic approach, one which would comprehensively relate the details of the case. While nonfiction, I wanted to tell the story more like a novel. And I wanted to do more than just relate a true-to-life melodrama. Since the early 19th century, historians, poets, and other writers from eastern Massachusetts have been Boston-centric in their retelling of the colony's role in the Revolution, to the neglect of many other towns. Worcester's contribution to the conflict and the events leading up to the opening gunshot looms dramatically larger than the mere 1,800 residents of 1778. I chose the tale of Bathsheba and her murderous lovers as the frame upon which to construct Worcester's significant role in the rebellion. In one example of that, in January of 1775, two farmers were seen walking down on a Saturday afternoon down what is now Belmont Street, which is kind of odd. The next morning, as the Worcester people are returning home from church around noontime, the two men are at what is now Lincoln Square in Worcester, still dressed as farmers, with sketchbooks. Of course, what they were doing, there were spies sent by General Gage in Boston to map out Worcester's roads. Worcester had cannon behind what is now City Hall, then the town meeting house. And Concord, of course, also had cannon. And the two spies conferred with Gage, well, are we attacking Concord or Worcester? Let's see, Concord is 20 miles from Boston. Okay, Worcester is 40 miles, both have cannon. Worcester, topographically, leaving Boston gets hillier and hillier and hillier. Concord is essentially a straight shot until the last couple of miles. And thirdly, was probably the most important one. They were radical in Concord. In Worcester, they were phenomenally crazy, the radicals. And Boston knew that. And given what they had done at the courthouse, Gage did not want to engage his troops 40 miles from Boston. They speculated what would have happened to their troops by the time they marched back the 40 miles from Worcester to Boston. Who would have been left? As you know, several dozen died leaving Concord. So Concord was chosen. On actually, again, noontime of April 19th, a horse and rider came galloping down what is now Main Street in Worcester. The rider shouted again, sounds like a Hollywood scene, but it happened. The rider shouted, Lexington and Concord had been attacked. The horse collapsed and died. It was the longest ride by any horse and rider that day. Israel Bissell had ridden from Watertown to Worcester before the horse died on the same horse. The next day he woke up, jumped on another horse, rode to Leicester, and continued on to Philadelphia. He rode 300 miles to Paul Revere's 13. How did her father's notoriety contribute to Miss Spooner's downfall? Brigadier General Timothy Ruggles, legendary attorney, judge, hero of the French and Indian War, and Speaker of the Massachusetts House, in 1765, made clear his devotion to the king when refusing to vote with the colony's delegation to New York in condemning the newly imposed stamp tax. Along with Governor Hutchinson, Ruggles became regarded as the Bay State's most notorious loyalist. Next to youngest Bathsheba had apparently always been his favorite child. Now married to Bostonian Joshua Spooner in Brookfield, her isolation from her father several miles distant and nearly 70 miles from the colony's capital likely only distressed a dynamic, erratic personality such as hers. Her father's removal to Staten Island, of course, only worsened the situation, further exacerbated by her own loyalist stance. Was Bathsheba insane? Playing armchair psychologist from nearly 2.5 centuries away is tenuous for a professional, for me impossible. We can only speculate, and the facts might lend themselves to characterizing Miss Spooner as imbalanced. She had a sharp temper, was involved sexually with at least 2 and more likely 5 men, none of whom were her husband. She freely welcomed 2 enemy POWs into her home, and on occasion, a handsome teenager in her husband's presence. Her actions were often erratic. She allowed her 2-year-old daughter to touch her husband's corpse. She jeopardized the future lives of her 3 surviving children. She lied incessantly. Would we be safe in assuming that she at least exhibited signs of a disordered personality? Although her attorney suggested insanity during the trial, it would take many more decades before such a defense would be admissible in a court of law. Was teenager Ezra Ross truly guilty, and of what? This is one of the hardest to answer, and the overall situation perhaps the most poignant of the saga. Age-wise, the 18th century freely condemned teenagers. But what exactly was his role? It appears that he had had no knowledge of the murderous March 1st plot before that date. He had spent many days before at his Topsfield home. Had Bathsheba sent him any letters while there? Given the slow pace of mail, it's unlikely. He turned up in Brookfield only hours before the murder, which he did discuss with the 2 British men and Bathsheba. And keeping in mind that weeks earlier he had tried to poison Spooner and had planned to try again before leaving for Topsfield, his background certainly did not incline the jury to consider his role more leniently. Just a couple of readings. The first reading is a petition to Bathsheba, from Bathsheba to Boston. Recall that she has already had the first exam done, disproving her pregnancy. She's insisting in this letter that she is pregnant. May it please your honor, with unfeigned gratitude, I acknowledge the favor you lately granted me a reprieve. I must beg leave once more, humbly to be at your feet, and to represent to you that though the jury of matrons that were appointed to examine into my case have not brought it in my favor, yet that I am absolutely certain of being in a pregnant state, and above 4 months advanced in it. And the infant I bear was lawfully begotten. I am earnestly desirous of being spared till I shall have been delivered of it. I must humbly address your honors, not understanding my great unworthiness, and take my deplorable case into your compassionate consideration. What I bear and already perceive to be animated is more of the fault of her who bears it, and has, I beg leave to say, a right to the existence which God has begun to give it. Your honor's humane Christian principles, I am certain, must lead you to desire to preserve life rather than to destroy it. Suffer me, therefore, with all earnestness, to beseech your honors to grant me such a further length of time, at least as that there may be the fairest and fullest opportunity to have the matter fully ascertained, and, as in duty bound, shall during my short continuance pray. And lastly, this reading is of the night of the murder. So Joshua Spooner's enjoying dinner with his Dr. King and his wife in the center of Brookfield. A lookout was set up by the parlor door window, as Joshua was expected at any time. Bathsheba called into the kitchen for some supper for the men. Brooks and Buchanan took a seat near Ross, helping themselves to a bowl of flip. A few minutes later, Mrs. Stratton brought them dinner. At the center of town, Joshua was passing the evening amiably. He was, in the words of innkeeper Ephraim Cooley, pleasant and sociable, sharing a glass of rum with Dr. King and his wife after dinner. Dr. King testified that Spooner departed at the same time as he and his wife, well between 8 and 9 o'clock. The Kings, however they were traveling, unfortunately did not offer to accompany Spooner home. At the Spooners, according to the testimony of Sarah Stratton, Bathsheba took her dinner in the kitchen with a Mr. Gray and his partner, men further identified simply as 2 boarders. Mysteriously, outside of the few mentions they receive in the housekeeper's testimony, their names never reappear. The second unnamed boarder retired once dinner was finished. In the parlor, Stratton served rum to Buchanan, Brooks, and Ross, who had been drinking for about 45 minutes, not including any alcohol they may have consumed prior to arriving, in Brookfield. Each took a turn as a lookout. And I mentioned in the book the consumption of alcohol in the 18th century. There was the pre-breakfast drink, the breakfast drink, the post-breakfast drink, the pre-lunch drink, the lunch drink, the post-lunch drink, drinking all day long, rum and hard cider. John Adams, before he rolled out of bed in the morning, would have a hit of rum. And he complained about people drinking excessively. The work of laborers was intensely difficult, and maybe the alcohol kept them going through the day, as it did Bathsheba's two lovers here, the British soldiers. But I read elsewhere that even crimes today, 80% of murders committed today are committed by somebody under the influence of one substance or another. So it goes way back. Spooner, in high and possibly intoxicated spirits, left Cooley's with no reason to suspect that this would be his final walk. As he had banished Buchanan and Brooks from his home 2 weeks earlier, he did not expect to see them ever again. He had also bid farewell to Ross at about the same time. Further, Spooner had never given any indication that he believed his wife wished him dead. The night was cold. Although only a short distance from his home, Spooner may have wished he had taken his horse. If he had, his evening might have turned out very differently. One of the conspirators saw Joshua approach. Brooks left the parlor to stand within what was referred to as the small gate, entryway, which led into the kitchen. Before leaving the room, he picked up a foot-long log from the hearth. Joshua approached, the crunching snow, the only sound disturbing the silence. Bathsheba remained in the kitchen, her children asleep by the fire. It was just before 9 o'clock. As Buchanan later wrote, and then was the time for the devil to shew his power over them who had forsaken God. I'll leave you hanging right there. Any questions? No, thank you. Sure.
How old were your children at the time of her arrest? And how soon was she arrested? Was she kept in jail? In jail during the trial?
Sure. So the kids were 2, 3, and 5. One child had died in childbirth. The situation for the arrest reads like Keystone Cops in reverse. The night of the murder, the men flee to Worcester on horseback and foot. They arrive at Walker's Tavern at 4 o'clock in the morning, rousing the curiosity of the innkeeper and the enslaved woman I mentioned, Prudence. And they tell a fib that the Springfield Guard were pursuing them. Yes, following a snowstorm, the Springfield Guard are going 50 miles through the snow to catch up with you. They knew it was nonsense. The next day, and this is the most comical episode of the entire story, after drinking, again, excessively all day long to drown their sorrows, Buchanan and Brooks are at a different tavern in Worcester, and Brooks, shall we say the less intellectually endowed of the two, stretches out his legs, and he's wearing silver-buckled boots with monogrammed J.S. Joshua Spooner on them, and they're horrified. They're arrested on the spot. About an hour later, they catch up with Ezra Ross. Kind of poignantly, he's hiding in the loft, as a teenage boy might do, in another tavern. They pull him down from the loft. Bathsheba is arrested the next morning, and she's brought by sleigh from Brookfield to Worcester. Right, they're all held in jail until the trial.
How long would that whole process have taken?
So they were arrested March 2nd and 3rd. The trial was April 24th. Yeah, that's the really strange thing. The trial was 14 hours long. Can you imagine this trial today? So you have 2 British nationals, 2 Americans, a woman which back then the prejudices brought against her. And in fact, she was the daughter of the most notorious loyalist in Massachusetts. As you could discern from the story, how did things really play out? Who knew what? Who was involved with what? Who had planned things beforehand? We really don't know. Was it all spontaneous? Did she know anything about it? I think she did. I mean, she had tried to plan several scenarios beforehand. My point being, it's a vastly complicated trial. One attorney joked to me, it would take 4 months today to choose a jury on a trial like this. you know. And I often have people imagine, can you imagine Maura Healey's daughter hooking up with an Al-Qaeda? I mean, it would not be a Massachusetts story. It would be an international. No one would believe it. Yeah, sure.
How did they actually implicate Bathsheba?
Sorry, how they implicate her?
How did they implicate her in the situation?
There was a confession by the two British soldiers. I don't think Ezra Ross signed the confession, but the British men did. Bathsheba would always kind of hintingly say, I'm behind all this. Oh, don't blame the other servants in my house. I'm the responsible one. Oh, no, I had nothing to do with this. She was hedging back and forth. She kind of implicated herself. And, of course, there was no, you could not implicate yourself during trial. None of them testified during the trial. So.
In your opinion, is this a notorious event because of the trial or because a woman was involved in a conspiracy for murder? What's the balance there?
Yeah, I think it's notorious. It's a sensational story, I think. I think that happened during the Revolution. I think that was the first of its nature. It's interesting, the attention we bring to this trial. If you look at the three sensational trials of, early Massachusetts, you have the Salem witch trials, Lizzie Borden, late 19th century, and in the middle, Bathsheba Spooner. So these are the three, all women. That may say something about us or about them, I don't know. But it garnered a lot of attention. I think, again, the ingredients, British soldiers, American soldier, her father, such a prominent politician, she's from an elite level of society. I think that's a balance of all, I think. Yeah. Sure, yeah. Right. So her husband is murdered. The father of her child is executed. She's executed. What happens to her three children? That's why I think she was imbalanced. And did she care at all? If a father left the family in the 18th century, that usually worked out legally. They could find uncles or brothers. When the woman left the family, it's not of consideration. The mother does not leave the family. So they must have been horrified in the 18th century. So I don't think she was thinking at all. Everything seems kind of the minute when it happened, one thing after the other. It's very strange. Sure.
So she abused by her husband? What was the whole, what would have made, I know she was a
Yeah.
what would have made her want to have this happen?
This is the legend that Joshua was abusive, and he may have been. And not to excuse abusive men who were drinking, but that's probably half of Brookfield. But not just that, half of men in Brookfield were not murdered by their wives. It's hard to say. He may have been abusive, but I always say, well, who's the abusive one in this relationship? She's having men come in and out of the house repeatedly. Also, the only time we run across Joshua is when someone is stealing something from him. They're about to steal something from him. They're threatening his life. How will you and I respond in those cases? Wouldn't be all sunshine, I don't think. Who had heard of the case before? How many were familiar with this story? A couple, yeah. Which is amazing to me. I think if this had happened in Philadelphia or New York, it would be a much more famous story. But happening in the village, in Brookfield, I think also it fell off the screen once it happened. I think Massachusetts just was so embarrassed by it. I've suggested, and it sounds maybe a little crazy, but maybe the Boston authorities did not want this to continue. Did they want Bathsheba's child to survive perhaps 80 more years in Massachusetts? Everybody whispering, that's Bathsheba's son. I don't think they wanted to deal with that. So they gave the first exam. It was authorized. It showed you're not pregnant. The revolution, we're at the midpoint. Towns are devoid of men. Women are running estates. Inflation is running 10 times what our inflation rate is running, believe it or not. It's just a very stressful time. And I think they just wanted to move on, for better or worse. Yeah. So legendarily, one died in a shipwreck off of England. Another one became a successful Boston businessman. Her daughter, who touched the corpse, died hopelessly insane in the late 19th century. Now, what does that mean? Did she have advanced Alzheimer's, severe dementia? Did she suffer from bipolarity? Or maybe was she put away in an institution by her husband? Who knows? Which was not that unusual an occurrence back then. Historians have tried to trace a line of insanity through the family. Her uncle was insane. Her favorite sister, the Green Estate, went temporarily insane. Well, wouldn't anyone go temporarily insane when their favorite sibling was just executed with 3 other men while pregnant? So the aunt may have been probably the strangest story in the book. So her father had this huge estate in Hardwick. Sat down to dinner one night, and they finished eating dinner. And the wife asked him, "Did you enjoy your dinner?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That was your favorite dog." Might be a legend, might not be. But we know that she never went to Nova Scotia with him. She stayed behind. Yeah. By the way, she ran the Newcomb Tavern in Sandwich. That's where Bathsheba was born. Any other questions? Or?
No, you mentioned that there was it a courthouse in Worcester where it said the real revolution, maybe not Revolution War, but the revolution began. But I think you may have a little competition because I think that's the story here. It was at the courthouse.
Do you know what the date was in Barnstable? What date?
It's on the.
September 1774.
So the same month. Interesting.
Oh my.
Yeah. Do you know how many protested or what the numbers were like? Or
1500.
no, so it's pretty substantial. Yeah. I think, like I mentioned, Worcester got the attention being the closest to Boston of the 4 sites, now 4 sites. Like the numbers were the biggest also. Also, again, the Worcester radicals had been threatening the British judges and British authorities for some time in Worcester. So that may have been why the attention was brought to Worcester, possibly. But I think they all should share it. I agree. I think Springfield should share in it. Yeah, Barnstable, Great Barrington should. Yeah. And there was a plaque in Great Barrington mentioning that episode. I don't know Springfield. Not sure. Well, thank you.
So please join us for a reception in the other room.
I'm happy to sign books if you'd like a book. Thank you.